start the presentation. So, welcome all to our virtual lunch and learn meetup. We are so thankful and lucky to have with us Marius Solbakken, who is going to tell us a little bit about surprising ways of escalate privileges in Entra ID. But first, we are going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. The virtual lunch, this meeting is, as I said before, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel after the meeting. So if you don't want to be on the recording or on camera, please keep your camera off and or leave the meeting if you don't want to be on the recording. These meetings last usually around 30 to 45 minutes. Feel free to raise your hand and come off mute if you want to speak, but otherwise, please stay muted during the call. Hopefully, there will be some time for Q&A after the session. So please use meeting chat to send questions as we go. We will monitor the chat as well. So without further ado, please welcome Marius Solbakken.
Thank
you for being here.
I will share my screen as well. There we go. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat if there's any question, but feel free to just unmute and ask if you feel that I don't see the question. Awesome. So my name is Marius Solbakken Melum. I'm a co-founder and principal cloud engineer at 42. I'm also Microsoft MVP in security and been working on different Microsoft identity stuff for 15 years or something. I do some like technical blogging and digging around in Entra and Azure and whatever on goodworkaround.com. So essentially what we're going to talk about today is misconfigurations and different patterns leading to unintentional possibilities for privilege escalation. And what that means is essentially that there's plenty of ways to configure things in Entra ID in a way that have some surprising consequences. And we're also going to talk a bit to what to avoid and what to do as a developer in this world and whoever sort of manages the Entra ID. There's a few things we will not talk about, which is like phishing, brute force attacks, and abusing single sign-on and social engineering and things. But they are also, of course, absolutely different attack paths as well. But we're going to have sort of a more technical approach. So when I say an attack path, what is that really? Well, essentially, it's a, let's call it a graph of different configurations or different situations. That is that sort of the sum of those leads to the possibility of a privilege escalation. So, for example, if an attacker, and I'll get into a few of these, but it could be that an attacker has access to to credentials for a user and able to sign in, and a credential here could also be an access token, and they can then use those or that user's privileges to add a secret to an app registration. The app registration is just a definition for an enterprise app with some privileged role, and that again can be used to assign global administrator. So that is one simple attack path, but you definitely have more advanced paths as well, sometimes with different like requirements throughout the path. But for example, let's say we have an attacker that has the ability to run code on a device in your environment and essentially access your environment as a signed-in user. Then we might use the same privilege, being owner to an app registration, to access something, for example, an enterprise app with organization read write all, which can add a trusted root certificate. And given that certificate-based authentication is enabled and the attacker has this ability, then he can impersonate essentially any user, even global admins, but he can use that for like further more or more paths essentially. So some of them are quite difficult to sort of I can imagine, but essentially we have quite a few things that we at least should be very aware of in Entra ID. And I'm definitely not saying that Entra ID in itself is not secure or anything. It's just that it grants you as an admin the option of configuring very different or many different things, and the combination of those can have consequences essentially. So first of all, let's just talk about Entra ID roles as sort of the simplest thing. Of course, we have global administrator, aka God, and we have two more, which is the privileged role administrator and privileged authentication administrator. All of these are essentially the same. It's just that the two bottom ones can assign global admin or change the password of global admins. So these, of course, should be protected very well and audited and everything. But we have some other less privileged roles, such as user administrator. So, of course, a user administrator can create, update, and delete users, but he cannot essentially do anything with a user that is assigned global administrator. So the different high privileged roles he cannot touch. But he can reset passwords, and but he can also manage groups. We have things like authentication administrator that can reset MFA and create temporary access pass, meaning that you can create a one-time password for a user. And groups administrator and cloud application administrator and a lot of different roles. And all of these definitely comes with their own sort of risk. Also, most people have heard about privileged identity management, where essentially you can say that you're either you have a role as actively assigned, meaning that you are currently, let's say, a global administrator, and you can also be eligible, meaning that you need to activate your global administrator or another Entra ID roles. So one of the interesting things in Entra is account protection when you are assigned these high privilege roles. So in order to avoid many of the privilege escalation methods, whenever you're assigned these roles, only the global administrator role can actually modify your account and essentially assign those different roles and everything. So you have this privileged role administrator and stuff, and automatically when you are assigned, let's say, global administrator, you are protected. So we have something called protected roles. So we're gonna demo some here and have a look at how this works. So let's see if I can find my correct window. Oops, like this. So I'm signed into a tenant as Adele here, and she has the user administrator role active. So that means she can do anything to different users. So I have some users here. I have named them targets, which is so they're easy to find. So I have 4 different targets. They all are global admins. So let's look at the first one. This is target number 1, global admin. We can have a look at his assigned roles. He has an active assignment for global administrator. So he's just permanent global admin. This is what many people do, especially if they do not have Entra ID P2. So they're just actively assigned. So as a user administrator, I can try to go and reset password, but I cannot. I don't have access to reset the password for this account because I don't have enough privileges. Okay, cool. Let's have a look at the next one. So this is also a global admin. He doesn't have an active assignment, but if PIM starts responding, we do have an eligible assignment to become global admin whenever this chooses to load. Here we go. So that means that the user is not currently global admin, but he can become global admin if he chooses to. So let's try to reset the password for that one. Nope, also doesn't work. So that's good. We cannot reset the password for this either. So many have heard of role assignable groups. So let's have a look at target number 3. So this person is also eligible, but this is through a group. So as you can see here, the membership is group, meaning that this person is member of a group that has eligible assignment to global admin. So we can have a look at this group. It's called Priv Vendor 1, and we can see that this has global admin assigned to it. So the user can activate the global admin role. Awesome. Reset password. No, also doesn't work. Fine. So protection is working as expected. So we have one more thing that I see way too many people doing, and that is this one. So we have a target number 4. He's a global admin as well. But when I go to assigned roles here, he doesn't have an active assignment. He doesn't have a eligible assignment for it. I don't know why PIM is so slow, but this will be empty when it loads. So he doesn't have any role here. But what he does have, which is not possible to see from the user page in here, but if we go to groups, we will have a group named vendor 2. So this group will have some assigned roles. So it actually has an active assignment for global admin. So whoever is a member of this group will be a global admin. So let's look at members. Well, there are no members. No, but you might also have heard of PIM for groups. So that means that essentially you can also make the membership of a group eligible. So meaning that a user can actually activate their silly, I need some more access to do that exact operation just to list it. Let's take this one. Like this and go just in some additional permissions just to list the eligible permissions. So we can see this that target number 4, he is an eligible member of this group named vendor 2. And everyone in the vendor 2 group is a global admin. So this target 4 can actually go in and activate their group membership, essentially becoming global admin immediately. And this is often used when you have plenty of roles. Say you want someone on the help desk or a vendor or something to have global reader, user admin, and something exchange recipient admin at the same time, right? Because then they only need to activate the group membership and then good, they have it active. The problem is that I can now take Adele here, which is a user admin. I can go to the user. So let's just find this target 4. And I can actually reset the password, even though this user can become a global admin. Now there are of course some MFA and things to think about here as well. So it's not necessarily the biggest crisis, but it's absolutely worth noticing that when you use PIM for groups, for role assignable groups, those are not covered by this protection. So yeah, essentially to summarize, we had these three options where we were unable to use a user administrator to reset the password. But for this eligible member of situation, the user is not protected. So we were actually able to reset the password. So a strong recommendation is to not use this method to make this or make things simpler for people, because it will bite you when it comes to possibilities of privilege escalation. There is one thing that might help you out a little bit. We'll have a look at that. So we have administrative units in Entra ID, and that is essentially you can add a group or add a user or a group to an administrative unit and delegate access to those. So that means you could say, here are all my students, or here are all my something, put them into an administrative unit, and then you can delegate access on that administrative unit. But you have one bit newer, still in preview, method called restricted management administrative units. And they sort of remove the, let's call them tenant level permissions. So essentially that means that you need to be granted access on the administrative unit in order to actually manage those objects. So let's just demo a bit around this as well. So we have a this user here. So this is a global admin user that I'm signed in as. So I have two administrative units in my tenant. So I have this example restricted management AU. Cool. So let's start by just creating a group 1, 2, 3 or something. And I have probably already forgotten what I can do with it, or what I called it. So this takes a few seconds, and it is here. So of course I'm an admin, I can delete the group and do whatever. Awesome. Now let's go to my administrative unit and this restricted management AU. So here I can add users, groups, and devices. Okay, so let's click add and find my group 1, 2, 3. Let's just add it. Awesome. It takes a few seconds to appear. So what will happen now is that because this is a restricted management administrative unit, the group will be protected from me as a global admin. So let's just see if it's fast or slow today. So I can now go to, I didn't see it appear, but let's just verify whether it works. Yeah. So this group is a member of a restricted management administrative unit, and management rights are limited. So that means that I can actually not add members or remove members, even though I am a global admin. I can also not change anything on it. Yes, I can delete it, which is probably true because I can, and because as a global admin, I can still remove this and stuff. But essentially, that means that if you need to, or really want to use this PIM for groups in order to elevate into multiple roles and stuff, make sure that you use this restricted management administrative units to secure both the users and the groups that you for these privileged accesses, because That will help a lot on the difficulty of using things like authentication admin or user admin or those roles. Because essentially now, in order to manage this group 1 to 3, we actually need to go into the administrative unit and specifically here assign roles on this scope rather than on the tenant scope. So do that. But anyway, let's talk a bit about applications. So I'm just gonna sort of make a stupid assumption that people have a bit knowledge on app registrations and enterprise apps, but in sort of a very simple term, app registration is the definition for an enterprise application, and an enterprise application is an instance of an app registration. That is sort of the simplest form. And an app registration can have credentials, secrets, certificates, and federated credentials. And we have something called managed service identities, where essentially you have different Azure resources. For example, a Azure function or a logic app can have its own service principal. So service principal and enterprise application is essentially the same, at least for the purpose of this talk here. So they will have their own service principal, but Microsoft manages the app registration for you. So essentially, Microsoft just handles the certificate in the backend that you never see, and you don't have access to the certificate itself, but you can get access tokens using the service principal. Very useful. Now, what I usually sort of try to or how should I say it? The simplest term when it comes to govern app registrations and enterprise applications is to assign an owner. And that could be a developer or an application, someone that actually is paying for the application and whatever. And that is very useful to see in Entra ID that, okay, this person owns the thing and is responsible and everything, but it has some access to actually modify the app registration. So that means it can actually add an additional secret, for example. And this is where things become a bit tricky for us that trying to have a secure Entra ID and a bit easier for the attackers. And you also have these app scoped directory roles. So that means that you can essentially say that we have the application administrator role in Entra ID. So when you have that on the tenant level, you can edit and add credentials to any app registration. But if you use app scoped directory roles, you can say that you have cloud application administrator only on this single app registration, and you even need to activate it using PIM. So just sort of trying to draw a backdrop for what we're gonna show a bit here. But what's worth noting here, there's currently no protection mechanism for things like, or for the app registration. So what does that really mean? Well, let's now see what we can do with some permissions or with an owner permission. So I have here a owner of an app. So Alan here, he doesn't have any other permissions. He has an app registration that he owns, and this is a high privileged app. Okay, so let's click on it. Let's have a look, for example, at the API permissions. So here, this app has role management, read-write directory. This permission can be used to assign global admin to a user. Okay, cool. And also, if we just look at owners here, we see Alan listed, and Alan doesn't have any other permissions. But let's go to certificates and secrets. New client secret. Add. Works like a charm. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, so essentially, that means that when we have this situation here, what we did was to use an owner to add a secret to an app registration. But that app registration is linked to an enterprise application that, in this situation, is granted role management to read-write directory. But we even, and I didn't show that, but if we, I don't think this user has access to that, but let's take this one. So if we now also go to the global administrator role in PIM, global administrator, we will actually see that I have even added the high privileged app to the global administrator role as well. And even though it has both the scope and a role, you only need one of them to assign global admin. He still has access to add a secret as a just unprivileged person because of the owner role. So yeah, that is something to be aware of. So I have one more thing for when it comes to that, because essentially what people know is that, well, you have secrets on your app registrations, sure. But I'm going to try to do a Teams raise hand. So who here knew that you can also add a secret to an enterprise application? Have you? 10 something? Yeah. Sort of works. You know, keep the audience on their toes. So essentially, I can show this because this is rather simple. So let's now sign in as an owner again. So I believe I actually added Alan as an owner of the, let's take the same high privileged app. I believe he is the owner here as well. Yeah. So this same application owner is a also owner on the enterprise application level. So, but in the GUI here, there's no client secrets or federated credentials or anything. They're just not here. Okay, so what can we do then? Well, whoops, wrong screen. Essentially, if we just look behind the scenes here, and let's just skip over to something. Let's take this one. We will have the ability here to see what it's doing, of course. This is known to anyone. But I can, essentially, this just uses the Microsoft Graph API. So that means that the portal here will have a token for the user to access the Microsoft Graph. Okay, let's copy this this token, and let's just bring up a PowerShell. Connect MG Graph scope. So I don't need that. I can just provide an access token like this, almost. Yeah, greenhouse, that's secure string. Let's do this then. Connect MG Graph access token like this. So I'm I now signed into the Microsoft Graph as this person, just using the Graph SDK, and essentially I can then try to, let's just try to get the app here. So we have an object ID for the enterprise app. Okay, get MG service principal ID. It's a bit slow here. So here's the service principal. Okay, cool. Then if I also had prepped the URL, then that would have been awesome. But you know what? I'm going to show like this instead because I don't remember the URL in my head. But essentially, what I can do then is just this: invoke mg graph request, just add password on my service principal, and I will have a password here. So what I then can, because this anyone can do with their own access token, and essentially what you will end up with is that you will have a secret that is not visible in the Azure portal at all, or the Entra ID portal. You will not see it on the app registration level. So these are all on the app registration level, but it can still be used and you can sign in with it, and meaning that a attacker that has temporary access to your environment, meaning that in this situation here, so if this enterprise application has some permission, it can just add a secret on the enterprise application level and hide forever, because essentially people don't monitor those kinds of credentials. It's also worth noting that this also works for multi-tenant applications. So that means that the app registration is in one tenant and the service principal or enterprise application is in another. So if you, as for example, us in 42, we have several multi-tenant applications. So that means we will have enterprise apps in our customer tenants, our customers' tenants, and a single app registration. But on those enterprise apps, some attacker might hide an additional credential. So there is a way to handle it, but it's not on by default. And this is this app instance property lock. So this is the only place where Microsoft uses the word app instance for an enterprise app. So it's just to make things a bit more difficult to understand. But by enabling these, that's no longer possible. So that means that just by enabling these, you will not enable credentials on the service principal level. So make sure that you enable those, or that you, if you actually need credentials on the service principal, then you should monitor those as well. So there's a question in the chat. We can detect this graph post via Entra ID graph logs, right? Yes, you can do that, absolutely. So that can be a very, very good idea, and you should get both. So let's say an attacker tries to do that. So he tries to add a password, but you have enabled this, then you can also detect that ended up with access denied. So absolutely, you can. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack, but of course here you can actually just look at whether it's trying to use the add password under service principals, which is sort of not something that happens all the time. It should, because when working with app registrations, you will be under the applications rather than service principals on top here. Cool. Graph scopes, let's talk about that. I'm ranting enough about graph scopes, but essentially they are built from object and action and scope, meaning that you will have things like role management, read-write directory, and application read-write all, user read-write all, and yeah. So you have a lot of graph scopes that are very powerful. So for example, application read-write all will be able to add credentials to any app. So if you have another app that has role management read-write directory, then this application read write all can be used to add a secret to the first app. And you have essentially in Entra ID, Microsoft hasn't done a super good job at creating graph scopes that are sort of limited in what they can do, for example, on administrative unit level and things. So don't blame developers too hard when they request a bit too much, because it's not always that the documentation is very clear on what they are sort of asking for. So for example, user read write all can create, read, update, delete all users except protected ones. And that means that it can do things like update users to match dynamic group criteria, and meaning that they can essentially add them to groups through that fashion. But it cannot update user passwords, luckily. So we have a few interesting ones where we sort of look at the documentation. So this one is one example that I showed in an attack path earlier. Organization read write all allows the app to read and write organization and related resources without a signed-in user. Okay, related resources include things like subscribed SKUs and tenant branding information. Sounds fairly straightforward. So we want to deploy tenant branding from our infrastructure as code repository. So let's use that one. Awesome. Well, it also gives you the ability to add a trusted root certificate to Entra ID. So if certificate-based authentication is enabled, you can impersonate any user that has certificate-based authentication enabled for it, including global admins. So it's not, as I said, don't blame developers too hard when they ask for things like that, and always investigate what scopes actually grant access to. And this is sort of the classic, which is app role assignment read write all, a useful scope that lets my service principal assign app roles. And of course, it also gives you access to grant any application, any Microsoft Graph permission. So that means that it can effectively grant itself global admin through just assigning itself role management read write directory. So this is perhaps the most scary one, I would say. We also have things like group read write all, useful permission for automating creation of Entra ID groups. But it also gives you access to all the contents of all teams and Microsoft 365 groups. So yeah, what are we supposed to do? Well, of course, utilize the least privileged scopes. You have scopes like group.create, for example. Maybe that's enough. You can you also have things like group member read write all, meaning that you can grant access only to change who is member of groups. And for example, group.create in combination with, let's say you automate, you want to use Terraform to create a lot of groups in 365 or in Entra ID. Then you can use group.create and add yourself as an owner of the group at the same time, because then you will actually have access to modify the group as that owner. So if you're accessing as a service principal, for example, add that service principal as the owner at the same time and use the group.create. Then you have minimum permissions that you can achieve. And you have some very useful ones, that things like application read write owned by, which is essentially the same. So again, I like using Terraform as an example. Let's say you want to Terraform a lot of service principals in your environment. Then when creating the app registration, add yourself as an owner, and with yourself, I mean your service principal, and then use this scope, application read write owned by, because then you can actually modify and do things later on. And monitor application credentials. So yeah, always question whether permissions are really needed and regularly review granted permissions. That is what you're supposed to do. So yeah, we can take the last topic as well. I see that it's 40 or gone 40 minutes, but let's just mention managed service identities anyway. So as I mentioned, a managed service identity is essentially a service principal linked to an Azure resource. It doesn't have any credentials that you need to handle. Microsoft handles it for you. And that means that Azure RBAC is critical to security. So you will have a lot of new attack paths here. That means that everything that has to do with delegated access through management groups or subscriptions or resource groups or directly on the resource and everything is a new path that you need to monitor, especially when you have different identities that either are assigned things like global admin or other privileges. But because I mentioned global admin a lot, but this can also be, let's say, group read write all, granting access to read all contents of your groups. That could be an interesting target for someone. Maybe you have a password for a break glass account stored on a team or something. And you have another way in, which is through deployment pipelines. So if you use GitHub or DevOps or whatever, and you use CI/CD to deploy code, then that is yet another way in. So yeah, make sure you fix that as well. I do have a very simple demo, but since time is going fast, we're just going to skip to key takeaways. So first of all, do not combine PIM4 groups with role assignable groups. At least know what you're doing and make sure that you use these restricted management AUs or administrative units. Enable property lock on your app registrations, unless you really need to not have that. Monitor app credentials, and that means both certificates and secrets and federated credentials. It could be a good idea, for example, to sort of have some kind of approval saying, okay, so this appeared, someone added this credential, that might be okay, but let's just have a check. Audit graph application consents. So delegated consents aren't really all that scary, but it's the application consents that are usually the most scary ones. So audit those and make sure that you remove whatever is not needed. Yeah, just remember that application owners can add credentials, and that also means on enterprise application level. Yeah, least privilege, of course. Scope your directory roles. There's currently 105 Entra ID roles, so this slide is a month old, so it's probably more now. And you also have like 400 plus Azure RBAC roles and the possibility to build your own roles. So yeah, something read write all may give you more than you think. And yeah, absolutely use managed service identities. They are amazing, but just watch out for RBAC-based attack paths. Yeah, so that was really it. I see there's some questions when it comes to the chat. I'm just gonna spend 10 seconds reading. Any of these best practices reporting by an identity secure score recommendations? No, not really. Well, some of them, like inactive credentials, is sometimes reported, at least when it comes to secrets and things. But no, not really. I do have a 42 security posture portal that you can use to get recommendations for that. So That's portal.amesto42.com. Yeah, so we got a third-party app that requests a lot of high priv graph roles, and as you can, as an Entra ID admin, is not very keen on handing admin consents to all these roles. Yeah, exactly. So I often see a lot of services that ask for especially group read write all. That is sort of the primary suspect when it comes to apps or vendors that request way too much permissions. And yeah, my recommendation is really to essentially, because what you can do, you can actually show them that this will work, because unless they check which permissions they get to your tenant, it's perfectly possible to assign permissions to the vendor's app, not actually assigning the permissions that they require. So let's say they have in their app registration that they want group read write all, and what they're going to do is create groups, and that's it. Then what you can do is that you can, for example, either say that, well, I'm giving you group.create, so you can show that that works. And if they add themselves as an owner, they will have all the permissions they need to manage those groups for you. But where we're going, yeah. So essentially, you don't need to use like the admin consent GUI to grant permissions. So if there is a scope that you know will cover whatever the vendor is doing, and you can also log these Microsoft Graph requests that the vendor is doing to check which permissions is actually required to do the things they do. Then I think you can sort of give a recommendation back saying that, well, we're not going to accept your default or request for permissions, but we can give you this. Go handle it. That was what I would do. Yeah. So I'm going to say thank you for listening in.
Thank you very much, Marius, for presenting your presentation. It was really nice and really informative. Thank you very much for taking your time and giving your time to us here in the Microsoft Security User Group. It was very good. And with that, we're going to stop the meeting now. So thank you all for joining in. We will also upload this presentation or upload this recording to our YouTube channel later on when it's ready. So have a really good day, you all, and thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.